Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Galassi. I'm Senior Curator at the Frick, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Mark Strand, one of America's leading poets. Mr. Strand is the 14th speaker in our Artists, Writers, and Poets series, sponsored by the Drew Heinz Trust. I want to express our great thanks to Mrs. Heinz and to her trust for supporting programs on contemporary art and literature at the Frick. While many painters, video artists, and novelists and biographers have accepted our invitation to speak, Mark Strand is only the second poet, the first being James Fenton in 1998. I want to thank some of my colleagues who've contributed so much to this evening: Alexis Light, Adrian Lee, Caitlin Henningsen, and Sean Troxell for all they've done to bring this evening together. Mark Strand's prolific and versatile literary and artistic career encompasses poetry and translation from the Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, literary and art criticism, anthologies of poetry, children's books, paintings, and illustrations. This in addition to 12 books of poetry. He's also taught literature and creative writing in universities throughout the US and abroad, and he's currently Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Mr. Strand was born in Prince Edward Island, Canada, and he spent his teenage years in Central and South America. He received a BA from Antioch College and a BFA from Yale, where he studied with Joseph Albers. By this time, he was about 20, he was already a recognized poet, and he went on to the University of Florence on a Fulbright Fellowship, where he studied the work of the 19th century Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi. He continued his studies at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, where he earned an MA in 1962, and a few years later, he spent a year as a Fulbright lecturer at the University of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro. During the 1960s and 70s, he brought out 7 books of poetry, including The Story of Our Lives, which won the Poe Prize from the Academy of American Poets. He also published translations of the work of the Spanish poet Rafael Alberti and the Brazilian Carlos Drummond de Andrade. With Charles Simic, he brought out an anthology of European and South American writers. He turned to other pursuits than poetry in the 1980s. There were 2 books on art criticism, The Art of the Real, and a monograph on William Bailey, who was with us tonight. A book of short stories and 3 children's books, including his wonderful Rembrandt Takes a Walk. In 1987, he was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship, and he was appointed Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress in 1990. For the last 20 years, Mr. Strand has continued to publish highly acclaimed volumes of poetry, winning such honors as the Bollingen Prize and the Bobbitt National Prize. The Monument of 1991, which combines poetry and prose, was described by one critic as one of the most astonishing books in the English language. John Updike reviewed Strand's book on Edward Hopper, which he published in 1994, and he characterized Mark Strand's prose as Hopperesque, saying he was coolly and eerily attentive to how we are moved and disquieted by formal elements in painting. His beautiful Blizzard of One won the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. In the following year, he brought out 2 critical works on poetry, Weather of Words, Poetic Invention, and with Evan Boland, a Norton anthology of poetic forms. He also edited several anthologies of poetry for the Echo Press in Norton. His most recent book of poetry is New Selected Poems of 2007. In the past few years, he was awarded 3 international prizes, including the Premio D'Annunzio. And his work of the last 40 years was recognized in 2009 with the Gold Medal for Poetry from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a prize which is awarded only every 5 years. Any reader of Mark Strand's poetry is struck by the precision of his language in describing things intensely seen and the quality of light, in imagery that has often been referred to as surreal or dreamlike. Tonight, he takes distilled moments of seeing in paintings by Vermeer at the Frick and in other museums as his starting points to share his thoughts on painting and poetry, seeing and knowing, a dialogue that has very richly informed his work. Please give a very warm welcome to Mark Strand.
Thank you very much, Susan. Before I begin this lecture, I want you to know it's going to be very casual. There's not going to be any poetry in it. I've set my sights on a few paintings, which will become clear. When Susan Galassi took me on a casual but informative tour of this museum with the notion that I might lecture on some of its paintings, I had no idea that I would end up with the lecture I am about to give. I had noticed, or perhaps Susan had pointed out to me, that there were more than a few portraits of women in the collection. In the days following, I began to mull over the possibility of writing about them. So I went back for another look and decided that because there were so many, I would have to narrow the scope of my talk. I rejected paintings that were portraits pure and simple. To write about them would have demanded that I know something, even perhaps a great deal, about their subjects. I compromised, selecting paintings that were not, strictly speaking, portraits, but whose subjects were women. I decided to write primarily about Vermeer's Mistress and Maid, and secondarily about Chardin's Lady with the Bird Organ. My talk would be an attempt to describe a connection between the two that I found intriguing, even mysterious. As usually happens, no sooner had I begun writing than what had been mysterious seemed less so. I became sidetracked by other issues and finally by other observations. Writers write, I believe, to find out what they have to say. Though I began this talk with the idea of saying something about a particular Vermeer and a particular Chardin, I ended up talking, albeit briefly, about several Vermeers, and more briefly than I had intended about that one Chardin. Mistress and Maid is one of 6 Vermeers in which a woman is reading a letter or writing one. And of those, it is one of 3 in which a maid is present. In each of these, the disposition or attitude of the maid plays an important role in providing the viewer with what he is to make of the letter, regardless of whether it is being received, read, or delivered. Yeah, I'm going to do that. You came at just the right moment. Let's see. Well, there. In Love Letter, there we have it. We look through a narrow opening into a room where a woman, cradling a cittern on her lap, holds a letter just delivered by her maid, who stands beside her. It is as if we were passing by and caught a glimpse of what was going on. The maid looks down at her mistress with a pleasant, knowing, and finally reassuring smile. The mistress looks up at the maid with a look that is hard to decipher. Now, I want to interject something here. Of course, these first 2 paintings I'm going to talk about are not at the Frick, and I looked at them in rather small reproductions. So you may be seeing something that I never saw, because this is much larger than the original and certainly much, much larger than the reproduction I was looking at. At any rate, she seems to want to be sure of something. That is the mistress. Can it really be from him, is what her eyes suggest? Or even more precisely, is this the letter that I have waited for? Do you really think it is? The maid seems certain that it is. Her smile and her casual stance indicate that she knows it is, and all that her mistress must now do is open the letter to prove her right. In the slightly later painting of 1670-71, back there, a lady writing a letter with her maid, no uncertainty is visible. The view of the room is an open one. The lady is bent over, concentrating on what she is writing. The maid stands back and gazes out the window. The world of this painting is tranquil. No perceptible signs of surprise or anxiety trouble the lady or her maid. The maid is absorbed in her waiting, the lady in her writing. Nothing suggests that we have walked in on a problematic moment. A problematic moment is what dominates mistress and maid here at the Frick. The mistress, richly dressed in a bright yellow fur-trimmed jacket, is in stark contrast to the maid, who wears a brownish outfit that covers almost all of a dull white shirt. The maid seems to appear from the dark, whereas the mistress is well situated in the light. One could speculate that such a contrast indicates a like contrast in the contents of the two letters. For in looking at a Vermeer, it is easy to supply a narrative, but just as easy to supply more narrative than is necessary. In the case of this painting, however, the moment it depicts is so charged that the offering up of a narrative seems almost unavoidable. The narrative I hinted at just a second ago, I wouldn't take seriously, of course. The mistress, whose face is turned slightly away from us so we don't see her eyes, which might have told us much, looks over at her maid. The fingers of her left hand touch her chin, a gesture that seems to be happening in the very instant of our looking. Her right hand, lightly holding the pen, rests on a partially written letter, the writing of which has been interrupted by the delivery of a note. Although the content of the note may not void the purpose of the mistress's letter, its appearance has put it on hold. We feel the importance of its arrival without, in fact, knowing its content. Even the way the maid leans slightly away from the mistress as if to say, "Here," and her uncertainty as she looks at her mistress suggests its disruptive possibilities. Assuming that the letter has come from the person to whom the mistress is writing, and we are made to feel this, its arrival is ominous. It has, after all, broken the rhythm that may be expected in any correspondence. One writes a letter, sends it, and waits for a response. But if an unbidden letter arrives from the person to whom one is writing, it can only suggest the possibility of crisis. That the idea of writing, the receiving or dispensing of information, is central to this painting is obvious. But what may also be true is that this is a painting that points up the limitation of painting. Its beauty is precisely in its depiction of a common enough scene that is finally unknowable and impenetrable, and in which the familiar is on the verge of being undermined by the unexpected. Here, explicitness is directly proportional to the mystery it accompanies. What I mean is that Vermeer's detailed treatment of surfaces, their clarity, the way they absorb or reflect light, provides a secure environment in which uncertainty or the consideration of uncertainty are able to flourish. Flourish up to a point, for it could also be said that what I am describing suggests not the limitation of painting, but its immense subtlety, that the gestures belonging to the two women exist more powerfully than anything the letter or note might say or imply. The unaffected, matter-of-fact characterization of domestic space, the casual disposition of figures, easily epitomizes what is most natural about them. Nobody seems to pose. Often, looking at a Vermeer, it is as if no painter had been present to paint it. Each work seems wholly absorbed within itself, generating somehow, without assistance, its own life. This attests to extreme detachment or extreme discretion. Either way, it is a mark of Vermeer's uniqueness. He is most himself by being nowhere visible, by giving himself over to things as they appear only as themselves. And unlike other painters, especially those in the tradition of the painterly, he leaves in his wake no telltale marks, no characteristic strokes of paint, no traces of drawing, no obvious signature gesture. Nor does Vermeer fit easily within the conventions of genre painting. Though there are overlapping elements, mainly those that have to do with the duties of daily life, it is clear that Vermeer belongs elsewhere. It is hard to detect in his work the geniality, simplicity, and openness that are so characteristic of genre painting. Instead, it embodies in its formality an element that strikes me as aristocratic, or at least privileged, and which may have something to do with Vermeer's invisibility. His women, for the most part, are idealized. They have a maid in attendance, are well-dressed, wear pearls. They are writers and recipients of letters, love letters most probably, and so are objects of desire. When they stand, they have a stately inwardness. When they read, they are wrapped in stillness and manifest the same meditative composure that we find in the figures of Piero della Francesca. Theirs is a dignity that lifts them far from the ordinary. Everything about the spaces they occupy, the dispersion of light, the strategic placement of tables, drapes, maps, mirrors, and paintings, is carefully constructed. But in this painting, the elaborate compositional elements so noticeable in other Vermeers are done away with. Two figures are set against a dark curtain whose folds are barely perceptible. Unlike the drapes or curtains in other Vermeers, this one is not pulled back to reveal. It is closed to ensure that nothing distracts the viewer from this moment of suspended thought. The painting seems both to bear the burden of this infinite moment and to dissolve within it. The twin gestures, the maid's offering, the mistress's uncertainty are its focus. The bared forearms of the maid and mistress, in parallel though opposing alignment, only reinforce and extend the moment, which in its immateriality looms so large within the picture that it seems to be its sole subject. One letter will never be finished, the other will never be delivered, and uncertainty will have been given a permanent place in the history of art. One thing, although I am sure there are many that I have not mentioned, is the quality of intimacy that is so palpable in this painting and in other Vermeers as well. One notices it especially in the paintings with one or two figures in them. I would exclude the elaborately staged paintings, which, though brilliant, are not especially intimate. In this context, what do I mean by intimate? I suppose what I mean is the visible inwardness of his subjects, those engaged in reading or writing a letter or making lace or seeing how one looks in a pearl necklace. It is their absorption in what they are doing that moves us, along with, as I have mentioned, their naturalness, their lack of posturing. We feel our access to them is privileged, that a private moment has been entrusted to us and to us alone. At first glance, Chardin's Lady with a Bird Organ appears to have little in common with the painting I have just discussed. A lady sits near the back of a room, turning the crank of a bird organ, surrounded by objects that suggest something close to clutter. Well, maybe. It's a very small painting, and so everything seems very close together. I mean, at this size, everything looks rather spread apart. In the foreground to the left, a bird cage with a canary perched inside sits on a stand. Further to the left, partially visible, a tall window lets in light that illuminates the lady but does little to brighten the room. Well, that's debatable too. A picture hangs on the wall behind her, which along with the window is mildly suggestive of many Vermeers, but not the one I have just discussed in some detail. Despite its gloom, it has a quaint charm, which is not something one could say about any Vermeer. Charm, perhaps, but quaintness never. Maybe it is the bird organ that I find quaint, or maybe it is the kerchief the lady wears over her head. It is probably both, as well as the singular act of playing the organ either to please the bird or to get a response from it. So what are the similarities Lady with a Bird Organ shares with mistress and maid? The lady's intense interest in the bird's response to sounds coming from the organ strikes me as similar to the way Vermeer's women appear totally engaged by what they are doing, although the lady's expression is tempered slightly by a bemused smile. Her eyes suggest one thing, her mouth something else. Another similarity has to do with the feeling we get that the scene before us has not been staged. The world of the lady and her canary, though open to view, is essentially closed off. That is, whatever action there is, the lady communicating with the bird, does not seem intended to resonate beyond the picture. Perhaps the most important similarity between the two pictures, despite their vast stylistic differences, is that communication is central to both. Chardin's lady tries to reach her bird with mechanically produced bird song. Vermeer's mistress is writing to someone beyond the world of the painting. In each case, the content of what is communicated cannot be known. We do not hear the bird or bird organ, and we cannot read the letters. Language, bird language included, though presented as a medium of reciprocal interchange, becomes an occasion for mystery. The longer we look, the more these paintings are enlivened by what we cannot know. The temptation to create a narrative, that is, despite one's best intentions, let me start that sentence again. First, I need a glass of water. The temptation to create a narrative that is, despite one's best intentions, doomed to irresolution and therefore to offering limited pleasure may not appeal to everyone. Likewise, concerning oneself with matters that are largely formal may not amount to more than a sterile exercise in academic thought. For some, the experience of looking at Vermeer's Officer and Laughing Girl may prove more satisfying, though even in this painting, the high degree of resolution, if tested, could also prove fragile. That is, the officer's imposing presence is domesticated by the girl's eager appreciation of what he is saying. It is only through her that he can be explained, that his presence can be understood. This is the beginning of a story whose end we can anticipate all too easily. The same could be said of Girl Interrupted at Her Music. A young girl has been engaged with a young man in going over a musical score only to be interrupted by someone who has suddenly appeared. She and the young man, more than exhibiting a shared interest in the music, clearly share an interest in each other. The mutuality of their interests can be surmised from the way they both hold the score and the way, with decorous indulgence, he leans towards her. Besides, courtship, or lovemaking as it used to be called, was often associated with music and still is. Just think of all those Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers movies, or the phrase full of innuendo, they made music together. And to further emphasize the love element, a painting of Cupid with one arm raised hangs on the wall behind them. This, according to a note in the Frick catalog of its collection, is a motif derived from a popular book on emblems of love published in 1608 and symbolizes fidelity to a single lover. The one questionable aspect of this painting is what to make of the intrusion. Because it seems sudden and momentary, it could not be blamed on the painter as painter. Making a painting takes time, so much time that the interruption would take months if the painter were its cause. As already noted, Vermeer, with his propensity for self-erasure, has put someone in his place, and that someone, we are made to feel, is ourselves. And yet Vermeer is unquestionably the source, the sole cause, and true creator of the interruption for which he has cleverly shifted the blame. I want to go back to the Chardin for a moment, and this is the comic conclusion, or near conclusion, to my little talk. The more I look at it, the odder it becomes. It is not that playing a bird organ is a peculiar pastime for a grown woman, nor that the quality of any exchange between a woman and a bird is bound to be limited. Rather, it has to do with the lower half of the woman's body. It strikes me as abnormally large. This may be due to the way the stiff material of the dress refuses to follow its actual lines. But even so, the legs would have to be remarkably long for the dress to break where it does. On prolonged looking, the torso also looks long. Or is it that the woman's head is unusually small? In any case, this wayward consideration having to do with physical proportion brought to mind another painting here at the Frick. The doll-like Madame Boucher has a curiously small foot, no longer than the width of her forehead. a shortcoming that is pleasantly made up for by the beautifully articulated folds of her dress. As amusing as it would be to continue a discussion of the physical anomalies that appear in the paintings here at the Frick, it is probably wise to stop now and take one last look at Vermeer's Mistress with Maid, where the anomalous appears in the form of letters at the instant of their crossing. Now, that is the conclusion of my little talk, but I'm very happy to answer questions, although my answers may not satisfy anyone. So, you're in the dark and I'm in the light. Now, yes.
The lady with the bird organ, that struck me is she was a bird.
Oh, yeah? Maybe that explains her desire to communicate with the bird. Yeah, I hadn't noticed that, but yes.
In the little flyer, it says that you would be mentioning given by Gainsborough, Renoir, and Whistler. Not disappointed that you said that as you wrote about this, Vermeer became more interesting to you as Boucher, somewhat perhaps less interesting. When you looked at those other paintings, did they lose their interest altogether?
Well, I didn't want to write about too many paintings, and I thought the Vermeers struck me as more compelling, to be truthful. The Boucher doesn't interest me that much. I included it at the end because I fixated on that little teeny foot. And I thought I just had to mention it, So many of the paintings here at the Frick are portraits, and as I said in my talk, one would have to know a great deal about the subjects, and I know nothing about, well, I know a little about a few of them, but I thought it would be more fun to speculate on that suspended moment in Vermeer and how it resonated in my own, thought. Yes?
Is writing about painting similar in a way to your translation? Is there something about those that are different than writing about a poem?
Well, writing about painting is different from writing a poem because you're writing about something when you're writing about a painting. There it is before you. And when you're making something up from scratch, you're facing a white sheet of paper and you've got to put something there. Translating is perhaps a little closer to writing about painting, but here again you're dealing with language. And you're writing with language as language, you're not translating visual language into verbal language. And not that I feel that when I'm writing about painting that I'm translating. I'm merely responding. I don't feel that my writing necessarily is a version of what one is looking at. My writing is if anything, an act of homage to the painting. My writing about painting. I only write about paintings that I really like. Otherwise, what would be the point? Yes, over there.
In The Girl Interrupted at Her Music, might the gentleman in blue leaning on the table be a stand-in for Vermeer? After all, if he were using a mirror to paint the scene and the girl was looking towards something, he would have only to look out towards our point of view, and then he could might that not be in some way a self-referential picture?
That's a very interesting idea. I hadn't thought of it, but I can see it's a possibility. Certainly, yeah. I'll look at it again and check it out. Yeah, way back.
I wonder if there's something about Hopper and Bailey and Vermeer that draws you to those three artists.
Yeah, I think they are related, and a few others. I mentioned Piero della Francesca here, too. Yeah, there is something about those painters, and I think I mentioned it a little in this piece on Vermeer, the self-absorption of the figures in the paintings. They seem to be drawn inward or drawn so far out that we can't guess what they're thinking of. And it's more pronounced in Vermeer that there's absolutely no posing going on, that there is a kind of, it's almost as if there were no painter. It's very odd. The more you look at Vermeer, the more invisible Vermeer is. But yes, there is that a meditative atmosphere that certainly characterizes Bailey and Hopper, Vermeer, certainly. Piero, especially, yeah. Yeah.
You're a poet, and I was curious.
I think so.
I was curious about when you look at a painting, would you see what I would, which things you see that I wouldn't see, or what's your approach? to looking at work?
I might not see anything that you wouldn't see, but I would write it differently, perhaps. I think that I don't feel things any differently than you would feel things, but I have an inner obligation to write and to present in some way what it is, reflect on verbally and present what it is that I feel or think. I don't feel poets are any different from anyone else or feel any deeper than other people. I just feel that they write poems. In fact, and that's the one thing that sets them apart, that what they feel and what they think finds its way into poems. And for most people who don't write poems, it finds its way into other things. Cooking, for those lucky people. Yes?
It struck me that first few years you were writing about painting that was about painting without writing, and yet you seemed very certain about the transference of that information in those letters. And I was looking at it in the opposite direction. It had this very certainty about what the letter was about, and where it was coming from, who it was coming from, who it was going to.
Well, some of the titles of the paintings, well, one of them, a love letter, is being written, and one can, I don't know what is, I say I don't know what's in the letters, but one feels, looking at the Mistress and Maid, that it's a critical moment, that the letter is unexpected. Everything in the painting suggests the unexpectedness of the letter. And I'm perhaps wrong, but I have a feeling, I have had the feeling looking at the painting, that the letter is probably coming from the person to whom another letter is being written. But I have no proof of that. It's just, I want to believe that because it livens the painting. If the letter is just coming from Joe Blow and not from darling Bill, then who cares? But there is something in that painting that compels our attention and I didn't talk about this, that eroticizes it. And this is true in many Vermeers. The sense of expectancy, the sense of interruption, and sometimes satisfaction, but not that frequently. Yes?
Have any of your poems been inspired by looking at particular paintings?
Yes. Sometimes unconsciously, but sometimes rather consciously. I wrote 2 poems after 2 Giorgio de Chirico's, one in Chicago and one at the University of Iowa. That's the only time I've delved into writing ekphrastic poems. But since looking at painting is a big part of my life, my psychic enjoyment, I may have been influenced by paintings and not have known it. I'm not somebody who looks at a landscape and says, I like those trees over there, I'm going to put those in a poem. I'm more likely to look at a painting and receive some sense of its order, and that will find its way into my poems. I respond to order more than I do to chaos. Way back there, yeah.
Have these narratives changed for you over time, and what influence do the titles have on your perception of painting?
I mean, the titles of the paintings?
Yes.
Well, clearly they have influenced me. I mean, but some titles, I mean, the titles in Vermeer are just descriptive of the characters. You know, Lady with Maid, woman writing letter, you know, woman at the clavier, the painter. You know, these are very, you know, indicative of what we're looking at. I mean, they don't induce a counter fantasy of any.
Have they changed over time, over the decades? Your narratives, have they changed?
Oh, vis-a-vis the paintings? Well, that's an interesting question. I would hope that they have changed, but not turned me against any paintings that I've loved any more than I would wish to be turned against myself at a previous time. I have always liked Vermeer a great deal. I've always liked Piero, Bailey, Hopper. These are all super painters in my estimation. And my feelings about them have not changed. Certain painters, however, maybe I thought less of Stuart Davis at one time than I do now, for example. Or, you know, once I loved John Marin, now I don't feel that much about him. That sort of thing, yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering whether, or it seems to me that just like punctuation and gives it meaning, or even the tension or surprise or eroticizing the color in some of these paintings, particularly the use of the red, adds to the narrative, the sense of surprise, the brilliant red from sheet for mustache. And I was wondering what your thoughts are.
I think it's possible that it can. In this paper, I wasn't that responsive to color except the yellow of her, which is so obvious. Yeah, it's not color that I think of when I look at Vermeer, that I take away from a Vermeer. When I turn my back from Vermeer and try to reconstruct what I've seen, it's not the color that I take with me, nor is it with Hopper. Nor is it with any of the paintings that I really like. I mean, if I'm looking at Joseph Albers, then of course it's color. If I'm looking at Rothko, it's color. I mean, I'm not sure how much to the, it's a lapse on my part, clearly. Sorry. Yes. I can't hear you.
Trying to communicate, to connect. And what we assume, or what I would assume that what you're saying, may be completely different than what you assume. But your connection is based on your experiences and mine is based on mine.
Yeah.
Which is what makes a really painting or poem so exciting, because we bring ourselves to it. And yet, the painter may have had something completely different in mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that a painter in the 17th century is putting into his painting what somebody in the 21st century is taking out of it. But I think it wouldn't be a great painting unless there was something. And all great art taps into something that's continuous in human experience. Doesn't matter whether it's a poem. I mean, if there was a great difference, if we were different in the year 1000 BC than we are now, we wouldn't be able to read the anthology, the Greek anthology, with any pleasure. But one of the things that binds us together as human beings is the consistency with which we experience certain things. We feel fear, we feel joy, we are afraid of the dark. You know, these are things that we understand from age to age. What changes is the packaging. The language changes. The technology may change, but we're pretty much the same primitives that we have always been. No smarter, no dumber. Yes?
I just wondered, given the fact that we have a visiting masterpiece here of a Dutch contemporary of Vermeer's, The Wonderful Woman
Yeah.
by Rembrandt, the woman looking out the window.
Yeah.
I was curious about your thoughts. I know you like that painting very much.
Well, I saw it for about,
But just in terms of the language of the painting.
well, it's certainly in the painterly tradition, and it's so, I mean, just the passages of Paint are so exciting, how he's able to describe so much with just the flick of the brush. I mean, the eyes in that painting are sensational. I mean, you look at them and there is such depth, and there's something so convincing about her presence that it's awesome, to use a much overused word, but it's really applicable in this case. I find the crackling and the dark background disturbing. I can't, but just the articulation of the features, I think, is magical, to use another word that's probably overused. But here I am, human. Yeah. And how, who? Yeah, he looked very well. He's, of all the novelists, of all the writers who's ever lived, he's been probably the most responsive. There's a very interesting little book called Paintings in Proust, in which the paintings of Proust, Proust looked at and mentions, and they're reproduced. And yeah, he's just amazing. I mean, he's amazing in so many ways. I mean, he's the great novelist of the 20th century, without a doubt. yeah, it's thrilling to, I mean, the book is a marvelous idea because when you read Proust, you want to see the painting right away. And yeah, absolutely, way back there. Yes, you.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can develop further your comments on why you've so seldom written extravagant poetry. Your comment that it's partly because you don't write description is certainly telling, but of course there's a lot of phrases. I'm thinking, for example, of Joy Graham, that isn't descriptive. So I'd be interested in other reasons you might give more to that tradition, and also any comments you have on the role of ekphrasis in poetry today. Examples of it that interest you, our use of it in FFA workshops.
Well, you know, there are different, you're right, there are different kinds of ekphrasis, and some fail because they're just, you know, verbal descriptions of a painting. I mean, I've only paid attention to 2 paintings that fall into the category of ekphrastic poetry. It's become something of a pastime for many poets. I don't know why. Maybe paintings provide instant subject matter for them. But there's another element of ekphrasis, and that is notional ekphrasis. That is, you write something that is a picture even though the picture doesn't exist. And that interests me more because I generate the picture verbally. It's not dependent on a prior formulation, an order to which I am responding. There's something a little undignified about stealing somebody else's formulation and, you know, writing your version of it and saying it's all yours. No, you don't think so?
I think of it as dialogue.
It's just a what?
Dialogue.
Well, it can be, but very often it's simply not that. It's just boring reiteration. Yeah.
Someone already mentioned the role of knowing the title of a painting and understanding it. Do you find that it's important at all, or rather, how important is it to read up on the historical background of the artist? Or the same goes for a poem. Do you find that it's helpful to know something about the background of the poet when reading a poem?
No. I mean, I think it's interesting, and it may not help you understand the poem, because poems aren't necessarily a reflection of the biography of the poet, nor are paintings necessarily a reflection or insight into the biography of the painter. Sometimes art is an escape from biography. You know, and not, you know, an embracing of it, or presenting of it. Yeah, Colin.
Does it worry you that the letter that's being delivered in the Mistress of May doesn't have a seal on it? And the letters we saw in some of the earlier memoirs have that seal, and so they are about to be opened. And it worries me that I can't see a letter that's come from afar. Where has the, why is it not stamped? Is it where?
Maybe it was sealed, I mean, maybe it wasn't sealed, it was written in a hurry and delivered that way. I mean, there's so many explanations one could offer, but I'm not sure I would put so much emphasis on the seal, but then I'm not an art historian or an expert in these matters or a curator. It could have been an oversight on the part of the sender. It could have been a joke that Vermeer was making. It could have been, this time I'm not going to put a seal on the letter, you know. Yes.
Returning on a lighter vein to the maze,
Yeah.
the feeling I had was
Mm-hmm.
being a bit judgmental, like "I told you so," or "aha," about the letters that were going
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah, well, there certainly is a class division, but there is also the possibility of some intimacy between mistress and maid, whereby, since they are together a lot, there is undoubtedly dialogue between them and shared intimacies.
Or they could be consorting.
That's a possibility as well. Yeah, yeah, Adam.
I can't help drawing as a conclusion that, especially Mistress and Maid, that why the painting is so successful is because it arouses all of these need to put, it arouses our need to create a narrative that the painting itself frustrates. We want to know what's going on. We want to know what's being written. We want to understand the
Yeah,
process.
we know everything but what's in the letters, you know.
But we don't get to know anything, and I want to know how, how conscious or premeditated is that for Vermeer as a mechanism? I mean, does he kind of, does maybe a part of him understand as an artist, well, as long as I seem to offer everything and yet leave it unresolved, painting remains compelling, because we get to keep projecting into it.
I see what you're saying, and it would be impossible for me to speculate on Vermeer's intention. It's quite,
Your intentions as a poet.
well,
Like that kind of built-in open-endedness. I guess that's what I'm saying. How conscious is an artist of that?
I think most artists want something open-ended. If everything is resolved, there's no point in going back to the work of art, whether it's a poem or a painting. There is something always that is unfinished or that draws you back, something you don't understand, some element of mystery that will keep you returning. If something is totally resolved, you just put it on the shelf and never think about it again. It's in a sense over. The experience is done with. Yes.
When you were talking about the paintings as being moments caught in time that would stay forever,
Yeah.
I was thinking about the Keats poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn.
Yeah.
And although on the urn, it's kind of a little more straightforward what's going to happen, and these are a little more mysterious, but do you find comparison or relationship between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're very right to make that connection. Yeah. Okay, one more? I could, yeah. So-
When you look at a painting, you mentioned that you turn away. Do you then reflect on what you've gotten from the painting?
Well, I don't go to the museum, look at a painting, and then turn my back on it. I'm talking about when I look at a painting and I leave, I think about, I don't see a lot of paintings. Usually I'll focus on a few paintings. I'll think about what I've seen. While I'm looking at a painting, I'm asking myself, what am I looking at? What am I seeing? What's happening here? And then I'll leave, and then I'll continue to think about the painting, and sometimes I'll have a less clear idea and have to go back to the painting, and sometimes I'll be able to write about what I've seen. It's about retention. I mean, one tries to hold on to experiences that are valuable. And, if you just experience and never think about what you experience, one can question how alive one actually is. I don't know how to put it any other way. One more question. Yeah.
In the absence of mystery, does peace suffice?
in the absence of mystery? Well, I mean, mystery is part of beauty, and beauty is part of mystery. I'm I'm revising Keats, I don't, okay, thank you.